How to announce a man that needs no introduction. Tom Palmer is truly a Students for Liberty evergreen. If you look inside the conference program, you shall see that he is the Executive Vice President for International Programs at the Atlas Economic Research Foundation, that he is responsible for establishing operating programs in 14 languages and managing programs for a worldwide network of think tanks. But what does this really mean in practice? It means that Tom constantly travels to the most difficult places on this planet to spread the ideas of liberty. To give you an example, only on Wednesday he was in Ukraine for an emergency economic summit for the Ukraine. But he's also been to countries like Afghanistan. He's literally helped hundreds of people across the globe to set up think tanks and student groups. For those of us who follow Tom on Facebook or on Twitter, it always seems like he's in 10 countries at the same time. So I'm always amazed that he finds the time and makes the effort to come to us and to speak to us here in Europe. So without further ado, I give you Tom Palmer.
Thank you. The microphone working? Very good. Well, before I talk about the topic that was assigned to me, one that has become much more relevant in just the recent weeks, I'd like to say that Students for Liberty is very, very dear to me. So I do a lot of things. I have various elements of my life, as everybody does, different facets. But one of the things of which I'm the proudest is I am a monthly financial donor to Students for Liberty. I have a reason in mentioning that, because many of you will be graduating, leaving university behind, and getting what is called a job. And at that point, the world will change a little bit. And I encourage you to consider becoming regular donors to European Students for Liberty, that this movement may continue. Your younger brothers and sisters will benefit from the literature and the organization and the conferences and the programs from which you have benefited. So very seriously, when you get that first paycheck, set up an automatic 10 euros a month payment program. And if you do that, and others come on later, this continent and this world will be transformed for liberty. Now I'm going to be going from here direct to the airport. So as our previous speakers and our wonderful colleagues from Japan mentioned, this is a global movement. And we're holding the first African Students for Liberty conference in the French language, which will be in Côte d'Ivoire, in Abidjan. So I'm traveling from here to go there so that I can amaze them with my French and cause them to weep openly, tears of joy, to hear the language spoken with such beauty. And then I go from Abidjan to the first Arabic Students for Liberty conference in Beirut. So this movement is growing. You are part of a very important global movement. Now what I want to talk about right now is a topic, as I mentioned, that's become much, much more topical. I've edited for Students for Liberty and the Atlas Network a number of books. The first was The Economics of Freedom, a reissue basically of some essays by Bastiat and Hayek, The Morality of Capitalism, and then After the Welfare State, a topic that affects all of you very much because you're being screwed by the older generations. Then Why Liberty? And discussing with our colleagues, we said we need to establish that liberalism is the philosophy of peace and reclaim that territory from the left, from the collectivists who have colonized it, because it belongs to us, a topic I'll be discussing at some greater length. And as we know from watching the television, following the news, this is a very real issue today. It is not just a matter of theory. Now the effects are sometimes hard to distinguish from tornadoes and lightning and so on. But war is different in a very important sense. It destroys things, but it doesn't destroy them like tornadoes do. It is organized human violence. That's what war is. When we hear sometimes people talk in very casual ways about force projection, it's a lovely Pentagon phrase, force projection or intervention, we should always remember it is the organization of violence. I remember years ago having a discussion with a retired American admiral named Jean Larac. And we were talking about military matters, and he said, one thing you should never forget. The purpose of the military is to kill the enemy and destroy his ability to harm us. That's what we do. We are not very good at teaching 8-year-olds how to read and write. We're not very good about building bridges unless you want to put tanks across them. We're not very good about teaching about democracy or civics or the rule of law. We kill people and we blow stuff up. And when you need that, call on us. Otherwise, don't. It was in response to those who were saying we need to deploy the military for all of these other functions. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright of the United States famously shocked a military man, General Colin Powell, when she asked him, what's the point of this well-trained military you keep bragging about if you don't use it? And he said he nearly had a heart attack to hear this said. The point is not to have to use it. And to use it means people will die. Or let's be more precise, they'll be killed. So war does a lot more than destroy the things we normally think about. Human lives, families that are broken apart, the destruction of wealth and property. All those things we know about, we see them. But there's another victim of war that's more difficult to visualize, and that is liberty. War kills liberty as well. It is the casualty that almost no one notices. If you think about what war is about, it is the fertilizer for state power. War grows the state like nothing else. Randolph Byrne, writing in 1916, summarized that war is the health of the state. The state grows through war. It acquires new powers that would not have been possible otherwise. It also gives the opportunity to plunder people. I love this statement from Tom Paine. In reviewing the history of the English government, its wars and taxes, an observer, not blinded by prejudice nor warped by interest, would declare that taxes were not raised to carry on wars, but that wars were raised to carry on taxes. Germans are probably aware of the special supplementary tax paid for decades and decades and decades and decades to finance the construction of the imperial fleet. That tax, of course, continued on long after there was no imperial fleet. Once you get the tax, it's very difficult to be untaxed. Once you've been controlled, it's difficult to be uncontrolled. Once you become accustomed to censorship, it is difficult to imagine free speech. That's one of the terrible consequences of war. And it's again an opportunity to steal people's liberties. Think about the United States, what Mr. Snowden has revealed to us. I'm very grateful to him for what he has done. When I first heard about the case, I said, I'm going to be skeptical. I don't know what this is involving. Let me find out more. And the more I learned, the more I was convinced he had done the right thing. He identified illegal, unjust behavior and exposed it the only way he could. I'm very grateful that now we know that the craziest, most outlandish fantasies of a few years ago were true. There was a movie some years ago that I remember seeing, and I laughed at it. I thought it was absurd. They're spying on you all the time. They can check your credit cards and so on. I thought, well, this is really over the top. No, not really. It's what they do. Now, the good news is they're drowning in more information than anyone could possibly process. That's the only consolation that we have. But all of this justified to wage war, waging war on terror. In the United States, the USA Patriot Act, just so you know, that stands for Uniting and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorists. USA Patriot. And if you voted against that, you are not a patriot. That was exactly how that was sold. The Congress didn't read it. They were stampeded into it. An array of unconstitutional, illegal, and objectionable assaults on personal freedom, made possible because of a war mentality. And then, of course, one of the greatest assaults on liberty, slavery, also known as conscription. The United States has an all-volunteer military, but they still keep this selective service system. 19-year-old young men must register under fear of criminal penalty to remind them they are the property of the state. They do not belong to themselves. They're the property of the state, to be dispensed with as the state chooses. I worked very hard on this issue years ago to kill the draft and then to kill selective service. We almost did it. And unfortunately, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, President Reagan, who was convinced it was a bad idea, his advisors said, better keep it to send a signal to the Soviet Union. And they kept it. I don't think the Soviet Union was paying attention, but we got stuck with this massive assault on personal freedom. Now, the principles of the Enlightenment and of liberalism were principles of peace. James Madison, I think, put it very well, and useful figure in the American context. You cannot really be called anti-American if you stand up for peace and quote the author of the Constitution. Despite the fact that the neoconservatives will call you anti-American, you have to say, well, then the Constitution is anti-American as well. Madison understood very well, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded. Every other threat to liberty is encompassed in war. State power, censorship, arbitrary arrest and imprisonment, socialism, nationalization of assets, all of those are encapsulated in war. Now, there was a time when war was taken for granted. People didn't think it at all unusual. Heracles of Ephesus puts it very nicely. War is the father of all and the king of all. And some he shows as gods, others as men. Some he makes slaves, others free. That war was the fundamental principle of the war. The world was bathed in war. War was the natural background of human life. It was celebrated. Joseph de Maistre put it very nicely. It's the habitual state of mankind. Human blood must flow without interruption somewhere on the globe. This is a rather shocking and disgusting view today, but it was once considered normal. War was the normal and perpetual state of mankind until the modern age. The first systematic movement for liberty was also the first systematic movement for peace. There were, of course, various thinkers and obviously religious figures who advocated for peace, but not movements. That movement was known as liberalism, and it is represented in this room today. The liberal movement is the movement for peace. We think about the elements of this. It articulated not only a philosophy of peace, but also the institutions of peace, of limited government, of freedom of speech, of criticism of the state, and very importantly, freedom of trade, because trade binds people together in peace rather than war and enmity. Our good friend Frederic Bastiat, my personal hero, it's my life's mission to translate Bastiat's works into every literary language on the planet. So far I've gotten through about 34. So I expect to live a lot longer because we have a few hundred more languages to go. In his address to the socialists of France, he put it very nicely. We believe in harmony and peace. They believe in perpetual antagonism and conflict. It is one of the distinguishing features of liberalism. It is the only ideology, if you will, that really holds peace at its heart. All of the others rest on philosophies of antagonism, conflict, and ultimately violence. As Bastiat put it, thing about the socialists, we could say this about other affiliated collectivist movements, all of the antagonisms they saw between property and worker, capital and labor, common people, bourgeois, agriculture and industry, farmer, city dweller, native-born and foreigner. That's, of course, a constant theme on the right side of the spectrum also, producer and consumer, and finally between personal liberty and a harmonious social order. In contrast, we believe in peace. Now, you may think, who really believes in war? Is there anyone who advocates war? That's not possible. But you'd be wrong. I'd like to introduce you to possibly the most influential political thinker of the last century. His name was Carl Schmitt. He was a professor of jurisprudence in Germany. He's often not quoted because it's a little embarrassing. He was the leading juridical thinker of the Third Reich, and also an extremely influential and very brilliant enemy of liberalism. He understood liberalism and he hated it, and devoted a lifetime to promoting collectivism, domination, hierarchy, and a philosophy of war. Here he is with his good friend Ernst Jünger, the novelist, again a brilliant artist, and in my opinion, a servant of evil. A man who glorified violence, struggle, warfare, dominance, hierarchy, his discipline, and subordination to the state. And of course, the darling of the left in Europe. And naturally, he died a green. Now, think about Jünger's contribution. Here he is as a kindly old man. In his very important book, in Stahlgewitter, in the Storm of Steel, his memoirs of World War I, he criticizes bourgeois liberal society for being boring, and instead held up as the ideal life, the life in the trenches, the life of warfare, the life of willing to take the life of another human being. And as he concluded his book, it is not every generation that is so favored. It is not every generation that is so favored to live through World War I and the trench warfare. And he set the tone for what happened in this country in the 20s and 30s. The artistic and intellectual and philosophical articulation of the antithesis of liberalism. An evil plant that we saw flower here in the heart of Europe, promoted by philosophers and poets. Schmitt, in his very important book, The Concept of the Political, says that political life is defined by the distinction between the friend and the enemy. The friend-enemy distinction is the fundamental distinction. And as he says, the enemy is not merely any competitor, just any partner of a conflict in general. He is also not the private adversary whom one hates. An enemy exists only when at least potentially one fighting collectivity of people faces another. And that is what defines politics. Us together against them. This side of the room, friends together in mortal combat with that side of the room. And that is the inescapable feature of human life, and something actually to be glorified. Now, this is very popular on the left also. I mentioned Carl Schmitt, identified as a man of the radical right, but the most influential thinker of the left today also. They love him. And Slavoj Žižek points out, one of the most clownish Marxist philosophers, but in a moment of clarity, he pointed out Schmitt was right, but the distinction between the left and the right was the right saw the enemy externally, whereas for the left, as he points out, A leftist position should insist on the unconditional primacy of the inherent antagonism as constitutive of the political. We must have enemies, class enemies, race enemies, gender enemies. All of the isms we see now articulated, all of those represent friend-enemy groupings and distinctions. And that is central to their philosophical perspective. Now, it plays out also in traditional warfare. The American neoconservatives are deeply influenced by Schmitt. Most of them won't admit it, but when you dig down, you find Schmitt is definitely at work. And indeed, in the Iraq War, was promoted, as William Crystal pointed out, we should embrace the possibility of national greatness. Restore a sense of the heroic. That was the philosophy of war directly expressed, and too few people understood what it meant. A glorification of war for its own sake, not a terrible necessity at best, but something heroic to be embraced. That philosophy of inherent antagonism is very much alive today. I highly recommend reading Professor Steven Pinker's book from Harvard University Department of Psychology, The Better Angels of Our Nature. It's a wonderful book. It's also a very challenging, serious, big, heavy book, but it's well worth reading. He points out that the philosophy of the counter-enlightenment is very much alive and well today. And the difference between that and liberalism is liberals see conflict as a problem to be solved through good institutions, through moral principles and norms and habits. We can reduce conflict. Ideologies of collectivism see it as something to be celebrated. It is their reason for being, to engage in conflict with the enemy, whether the enemy is foreign or internal in some way. We have to live to have an enemy. Liberals, in contrast, recognize conflict in human life and seek for ways to ameliorate it, to make it less bad, to reduce it, to bring about cooperation and harmony and peace. That's our goal. That is the fundamental distinction between our philosophy and theirs, whether they call themselves right-wing or left-wing. They are united in the belief that antagonism, hatred, and violence are inherent, irreducible features of human life, and something to be celebrated as well. Now, wars don't just happen. They're not like tornadoes. They're the results of choices. People make choices to go to war. If you think about it, if we make choices for war, we can make choices for peace also. And that's our job, to make the choices for peace. And I think it's the most important choice we face today. Indeed, we are facing it, all of you, right now in the European continent. The possibility, God forbid, that there would be a great deal of blood spilled on this continent again. So some of the key conditions for peace that our liberal forebears articulated that have been substantially successful: limited and accountable government that can be held to account, that is not absolute, freedom of speech to criticize it, open and transparent government rather than the trend towards secret government, as we've been seeing in many countries recently, needs to be fought. Active public discussion of these issues, and citizens who challenge their government. They go out and vote for peace. They work for peace. And when necessary, they resist on behalf of peace. And those deeper institutions, trade across borders, voluntary exchange. When goods cannot cross borders, armies will. Protectionism leads to war, and the evidence is overwhelming. The protectionism, trade barriers are a lead-up to war. If you want peace, you must work for freedom of trade. And then the presumption against war. Just as we believe in the presumption of liberty, we have a presumption against going to war. In a defensive war, you may argue it's necessary, but the burden of proof is on the one who would justify it, not on the one who would oppose it. And that is a very important principle for us to maintain. Now, Some have then argued a rather different case. Well, war can be profitable for the nation. Not just glorious, but you need to do it. It's good for the country sometimes to go to war. Well, it's clear that war is beneficial to somebody. The manufacturers of the arms and the war contractors and so on. Okay, we get that. But is it beneficial to the society or the country as a whole? Liberals maintained, and the evidence strongly supports, absolutely not. It's a catastrophe for the country as a whole. Adam Smith understood this. In his criticism of the British Empire, he pointed out that just the interest on the national debt required to maintain the military forces was greater not only than the profits on the trade, but the volume of the trade itself. It was a completely losing proposition for the British people to maintain the British Empire. The taxpayers, the people who bore the burden, as opposed to those favored few who got the monopolies and the privileges and the benefits of supplying the Navy. But the people as a whole were harmed by this. He understood that. Indeed, it was the free trade liberals who articulated the case against empire. The anti-imperialists were the liberals, not the Marxists by any stretch of the imagination, who come on the scene much later and typically glorify empire and war. John Bright, one of the founders of the Anti-Corn Law League in Britain, a great liberal member of Parliament, a great inspiration, dedicated his life to peace, freedom of trade, limited government, noted that the British Empire was essentially a welfare scheme for the unemployable sons of the aristocracy. Can't get a good job, go on to be a colonial administrator in India. And that this was a terrible deal for the British people as a whole. The most systematic study of the economics of the British Empire by Davis and Huttenbach pointed out it was a losing proposition for the British people without any doubt. Very beneficial to the special interests, very harmful to the British people who bled money and blood to maintain that empire. And obviously not beneficial to those people who then had monopolies fastened on them in the salt trade and all the other mercantilistic policies imposed on the empire. What about war for oil? I mean, after all, you do have to maintain all these troops there, the Persian Gulf, all that oil. Surely that's worth it. Secretary of State James Baker pointed out, he says, it's about a dictator who, acting alone and unchallenged, could strangle the global economic order by cutting off that precious oil. So of course we need huge military commitments to keep the flow of oil. Not true. The Cato Institute commissioned studies on this years ago, looking at the cost of the military commitment, which isn't free, it costs something, and comparing it to the worst case scenarios of a total oil embargo on all Middle Eastern oil. Which one was more expensive? The former, not the latter. Why? Because we have something called markets. Prices go up and people search for alternatives and they find ways to economize. Even the worst case scenario of a total embargo on oil was much less costly than the maintenance of the military establishment to keep that from happening. And that assumes Saddam Hussein was stupid and thought he could benefit by not selling oil to people. Work that out. Right? Even Hugo Chavez, an avowed enemy of the United States, sold all of his oil to American oil companies. He's not stupid. It's a commodity. There's a world market for it. So we do not need war for oil or natural resources. The late William Niskanen, chairman of the Cato Institute, debated before the Second Iraq War. He was one of the first to warn. He said, I hear a war coming. This is a disaster. Do not do this. And he challenged the former CIA director to a debate. And I think he wiped him out and shows that he was certainly right now, years later. We do not need war for oil. Even as an economist, setting aside his moral objections, as a libertarian and as a follower of his religion, he was deeply opposed to war. He said, I'm going to look at it just as an economist. This is a bad idea. We do not need this. Do not do this. Unfortunately, we lost that debate. And the United States and its allies plunged into a disaster in Iraq. Disastrous for the Iraqi people and for the occupiers. So we don't need, and most people do not benefit from, wars for national glory or national prestige or wars to make you into real men. You hear this sometimes, especially from the progressive left, by the way, in America. We need compulsory national service to slap the childishness out of people, turn them into real men and women, they add. But they really mean real men. Slap you around, teach you how to grow up and behave. We don't need wars for energy. We don't need wars to end all wars. We had one of those, and it didn't work. It didn't end all the wars. What do we need? What do most people benefit from? Well, peace, obviously, freedom of trade, limited government, the freedom to challenge state policies, in short, liberty. That is what is beneficial to the overwhelming bulk of the human race, minus those few parasites who live from the state, the tyrants and the dictators and the people who benefit from sacrificing all the rest of us. Even they are better off in the long run, though, because most of them come to a bad end eventually. Now, our cause can win. And here's the good news. It may not seem like it at any given moment, but we live in the most peaceful age in human history. It seems that can't be right. And as Steven Pinker points out, believe it or not, and I know that most people do not, violence has declined. It's even declined through the 20th century. It doesn't seem likely. You turn on the news, violence, 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 violence. But there's an old principle in news, if it bleeds, it leads. Nonviolence is not news. If you turn on the news and it says today, 7.5 billion people went about their business and didn't hurt each other. That's not news. But violence, conflict, kidnapping, murder, rape, these are news. And so our picture of the world is a bit distorted. When you step back and look at it with the tools of statistics and history, turns out you have the great fortune of being born into the most peaceful age of the human race. As Pinker argues, it's because your ideas have been so successful and have transformed the world. So it's not the case that we can't win. Just a little bit of quick data. If you think about territorial wars resulting in redistribution of territory, by the way, at the very end there, it's going to be a little tick upwards. Right? A little tick upwards at the very end there. But I hope that the general trend will continue down. The little tick is going to be called Crimea. And God forbid, maybe other parts of Ukraine. But the general trend has been downward. We think about wars between democracies and non-democracies. Those have been declining just in recent years, in your lifetime. Where are most of the armed conflicts taking place? Unsurprisingly, they take place in the poorest parts of the world. Those are also the parts of the world least touched by trade. It's a very clear connection between trade and peace. This is where the bottom billion lives, most of those areas. And here's the good news. The rise of international trade corresponds very dramatically with this fall in violence. So that is something we can celebrate, and it's something for which you can take credit, because it was the liberals who promoted free trade, and we effectively won that intellectual debate, although we still struggle on the margins politically. It's been understood for a long time, trade creates peace. And actually, that deep insight goes back very, very far. There was a poem by a man named Homer. You may have seen his TV show with his family, but he's also a poet. And this struck me in the Odyssey. I remember reading it a few times, and I read it as an adult. And it's about the Cyclops, these horrible creatures who, when you land on their island, they eat you. It's not very nice. And the question is, why is the Cyclops a savage? The answer is quite striking. They have no ships with crimson prows, no shipwrights there to build them good, strong craft that could sail them out to foreign ports of call, as most men risk the seas to trade with other men. Trade civilizes us. It causes us to see other people as potential customers, and more valuable to us alive than on a plate. Eugen Richter, one of the great free trade figures here in Germany, pointed out, if we could learn to see the other people as potential customers, we would shoot at them less often. I should put in a plug here for the great tradition of German liberals, and liberalism understood this, Eugen Richter, John Prince Smith, Ludwig Bamberger, and others, who fought in this city for those principles. They lost, and we should remember the consequences of losing this fight. But they did fight valiantly for liberalism in Germany. At the moment, all eyes are turned to Ukraine and what has been happening there. And we have seen a transformation in the political leadership of the neighboring country. A little bit different. This is how we were shown. The leader of the neighboring country is a very nice man. But he's been getting a little bit different in his public presentation. And now, of course, what is happening with the invasion of a nearby country by its neighbor. So as I mentioned, this is a very real and serious issue today. It's going to be something to watch, but also something to be active in. And I'm very happy to say there are Students for Liberty members who are marching in Moscow yesterday. So what do we do? Is Europe going to be plunged into war? I don't think it's very likely, but we should not forget this is a possibility. Not likely, but a lot of people didn't think in 1914 that they would be plunged into what came to be called the First World War. Nobody thought that at that time. Will young men and women be enslaved to die for national glory? Or will cooler heads prevail? What's going to happen? Will war be avoided? Will we avoid the glory of being sent off to die for our flags? What's the outcome? Who's going to stand up for peace? I know the answer. So war is a choice. It's not something that just happens. People generally don't just stumble into it. Some choices are made. And we need to confront those very directly. We need to stand against war, against invasion, against aggression, and to do so in an even-handed and honest way when we see aggression taking place, and be willing to call it for what it really is. I'm happy to say that there'll be our tiny contribution to this movement, a book coming out, Peace, Love, and Liberty, which will be coming out this fall. And I have recruited a number of very distinguished writers for it to make the case for liberty and peace. So Professor Pinker from Harvard University, very honored. He is a contribution in the volume. Professor Ramit McDonald from the United States Military Academy at West Point. I thought it was very important to have someone from the United States Military Academy who is a peace advocate making the case in this book. We have Radley Balco, some of you know, Kathy Reisenwitz. Some of you are also working with Kathy with the Young Advocates Project. Eric Gartsky, who's a political scientist making the case for the free trade peace. Free trade unquestionably is the most important determinant of peaceful relations among states. And he's going to demonstrate that clearly with the evidence, and other colleagues as well, and also some poetry. I'm sick and tired of the communists having the best poets. So we are also sharing liberal poetry for peace and freedom in this book. Now, the question then is, what's our plan? I want to conclude with some words from Frederic Bastiat. He was challenged when he was in the French National Assembly, well, what is your plan, Mr. Bastiat? You are so critical of all of the other plans of the other parties. What is your plan? This is liberty within and peace without. This is the entire plan. Thank you very much.
And since this year is the 25th year of the fall of the Berlin Wall, here's a piece of it for you.
Thank you.
As a memory from ESFL. Also, for those of you who, can I do this?
Yeah.
All right. So for those of you who didn't hear, Realizing Freedom got its new expanded edition, and it's going to be out of the print really soon.
Yeah. 150 more pages of action-packed liberty.
All right. So we have time for a really short Q&A, so 3 questions.
All right. And I should point out, at the time I did chip off a piece I still have in my office. So, anyone want to raise any issues or topics?
Tom, thanks a lot for this impressive and moving presentation. Just one thing, because what's next? To be very, very specific now, we have this situation, Ukraine, where people say, okay, we have to do something, in a way giving in, like the Attlee thing, peace in our hand and give them what they want, or him. Or they come up with sanctions. It's exactly that what I think is a wrong thing to do. So what do you suggest?
I always resist, and I strongly resist, the sentence, something has to be done. There's the old statement, something must be done, this is something, therefore this must be done. It's the logic of panic, in effect. We need to think very carefully about what must be done, and not just leap into doing something. To be frank, I don't think that Crimea is likely to return to Ukrainian sovereignty in the near future. I think they acted so fast, it's a done deal. Criminal, aggression, etc., but I don't know what to do about it at this point. Sanctions, very tempting, but I think they're symbolic. It was reported, Viedomosti reported on the 14th, that on February 11, the chairman of the board of Gazprom, Mr. Zubkov, sold 100% of the shares of Gazprom. He got a phone call from his friend, Mr. Putin. He's one of the cronies. And so he dumped 100%. Imagine the chairman doesn't own 1 share of the company anymore. And it's since declined 25% in price and will go down further, I imagine. So they've already liquidated. They anticipated this. So would sanctions hurt any of the people who matter? No, they were smarter than this. They listened to the radio. When they say we're anticipating sanctions, they took action. So I don't think they can be hurt. What would make a difference? Well, I do think that diplomacy matters in some contexts, but I would be opposed to trade restrictions with Russia per se. That would just make the situation worse. It would hurt the average person, not the criminals in charge of the state there. The average people would be harmed, and it would strengthen the power of the state because they would blame the harm on the European Union and the United States. This is a loser's game, in my opinion. What can be done? I think one thing is to begin actually more openness with Russia per se, not with the criminals in charge. And I would support visa-free travel, which is not what is being proposed. Let normal Russians travel visa-free. And I think that would be actually a better response than closing the borders. It would have a more harmful impact on Mr. Putin and his criminal gang than closing those borders. So it takes some thought. Don't go off with a knee-jerk approach. Don't do something because something must be done. Really, that needs to be resisted. And thought needs to be put into these matters. Then a policy that is likely to achieve the outcome you want. And I do think that unilateral free trade with Ukraine would be helpful. Visa-free travel for Ukrainians and Russians would probably be helpful. You could think about some other things as well, but those are liberty-compatible solutions that I think would have a positive outcome. The other things being proposed would be either ineffectual, such as sanctions on people who've already withdrawn all their money, so they're effectively immune from harm, or sanctions on people who are not responsible, which is the average Russian person is not responsible for what the Kremlin has done. I'm open-minded to other things as well, but they deserve a lot of thought to make sure they don't backfire and we don't get panicked into doing foolish things just because something has to be done. Time for one more, and then I have to go to the airport.
Thank you. Since we're in the same topic, I don't know what to make out of it. For example, in the States, they're talking about, some libertarians are talking about state nullification. I don't know the story of Crimea exactly. I don't know if you might know, but where should we stand here? Because some information says that the Tatars or big percentage of the population don't feel Ukrainians. Where should we stand here? Should we?
That's a very, very good question, and let me just be very frank and direct. The Kremlin has a very active propaganda machine, and they're spewing out a huge amount of misinformation, and they're good at it, and they're coordinated. So that means when we listen to the news, we should be skeptical of everybody, whether it's coming from Brussels or Washington or wherever, and think about it. This has been portrayed as just a normal peaceful secession. Most normal peaceful secessions are not preceded by armed invasions by a foreign power. So we should just be honest. This is an invasion, an annexation, and a phony referendum being held at the point of a gun. It happened before in Europe, in the Sudetenland. And I did take the time to read the legal briefs of Carl Schmitt in defense of that, his very influential essay on the Großraumordnung Europas. And it was word for word exactly what the Kremlin just wrote. They weren't very original. They dusted off the legal arguments of the Third Reich, and instead of Volksgenossen, they said our compatriots. That was the substitution of the word, our Russian compatriots. If there were a free election in Crimea, they might vote to secede. We don't know. We'll never find out because it's under armed occupation. But even if you assume that that the ethnic Russian population, 58% according to the last census, which is 13 years old, so it's probably smaller, since Tatars have a substantially higher birth rate. So it's 55 or thereabouts, it's a majority, were ethnic Russians. You would have to assume almost 100% of them would vote to become part of Russia. This is unlikely, in my opinion, that Russian-speaking Ukrainians would vote 100% for that. This is very, very unlikely. So probably a minority supports it, but we'll never know. But a substantial minority, let's be honest about that. But this is not a secession. This is an armed invasion and annexation, and we saw Mr. Putin sit in front of the cameras, and he lied to himself because no one in the room believed him when he said there are no Russian forces in Crimea. This is obviously laughable. There are 30,000 troops of the Russian Federation occupying Crimea. So we just be honest about it. The danger is to argue from your conclusion to the facts. I'm against war, therefore I argue to the facts it was not an invasion. That's really bad and corrupt form of thought. The facts are the facts. The conclusions we reach are based on facts plus our moral principles. I'm against war, but I don't distort my view of the facts. And we have just witnessed an armed invasion by the Russian Federation, carving off pieces of territory as they did in Georgia with Abkhazia and Ossetia. So be aware that that's the situation you face right now. And then try to think what is the best recipe for peace so that we do not plunge into conflict and violence. That is a horror, and we should do everything we can to stop that. But in the process, don't blind ourselves about the facts on the ground. Well, with that, I'm going to go off to the African Students for Liberty Conference. I land at 4:45 in the morning. I drive for 2.5 hours, and I give a lecture in Abidjan. So I'll be with your brothers and sisters in West Africa, and I hope I will send them your fraternal and sororal greetings. Thank you.